lived in the Jurassic period 160 million years ago. 160 million years? How did they come up with these numbers? That skeleton over there is supposed to be 65 million years old. That skeleton over there is apparently 120 million years old. We tend to take these numbers for granted, but how did paleontologists come up with them in the first place? How did they determine the age of dinosaur bones? Behind the scenes here at the Royal Ontario Museum, they have countless dinosaur remains in storage. Everything has been meticulously filed and labeled. Ooh, wow. Hadrosaur remains, 75 million years old. Wouldn't it be great if these tags were on the bones when you dug them up? Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy. But if you had to figure out my age, you'd have no problem, because I do come with one of these, my birth certificate. But what if I didn't have one? How would you figure out my age then? Well, instead of counting years, you'd find something else to count. Like maybe the gray hairs on my head, perhaps. Or maybe even the wrinkles on my face. This would give you at least some idea of how old I am. Figuring out the age of something always involves some sort of counting. But what if I were so old that all that was left of me were my bones? Then what would you count? How about carbon atoms? All living creatures absorb carbon atoms into their bones from the food they eat. Some of this carbon, known as carbon-14, is not very stable. It eventually breaks down and decays. But creatures are always consuming more. Until they die, that is. At that moment, the carbon-14 supply is no longer replenished. So the overall quantity in the bones begins to drop. This decrease occurs very slowly at a known rate. So if you know how many carbon-14 atoms were originally in this bone, how many are left, and at the rate at which they decay, you can calculate the age of the bone. It's just like having a birth certificate. There's only one problem. Dinosaur bones are so old that all of the carbon-14 in them has completely decayed. There's nothing left to count. Carbon-14 can only be used to date things less than 50,000 years old. But dinosaur bones are at least 65 million years old. If I happened to be a paleontologist who wanted to discover the age of a dinosaur bone, I'd have to look for something else to count. Something that hangs around longer than carbon-14. Unfortunately, I wouldn't find it in the bone. In fact, the bone is completely useless to me. This is what I'd be interested in, the rock that surrounds the bone. Many rocks contain potassium atoms. Potassium decays just like carbon-14, but it does so at a much slower rate. Potassium can be used to date rocks that are as old as the Earth itself. Counting the number of potassium atoms that have decayed will tell you when the rock first formed and covered the bones. So it's the rocks, not the bones, that have told us that dinosaurs walked the Earth between 225 million and 65 million years ago. So, if you don't need the actual dinosaur bones to figure out how old they are, what good are they? Well, the bones are our only clues as to what these amazing creatures look like, what they ate, what their habits were. Everything we know about dinosaurs, we learn by studying their bones. Everything, that is, except the age of the bones themselves. Coming up next, Mike discovers why mosquitoes find his blood so tasty. And we answer some viewer questions.